We are having welcome to our review session for the midterm. We're open to any and all questions on all the materials we've covered to date. So I'll pause and see if there are any big or small things you want to start with. At the beginning, we had an introductory session. We talked about some of the bigger themes about how globalization is a sort of loose, broad, huge, complicated field. And we want to draw on the broadness and the extensiveness, but we want to try to make it more like classic social science. We want more propositions, we want more evidence, we want more interrelated propositions and building on the histories that we have in different areas of the world. So how do we do that? Basically, what we take is, in the structure of the course, is to take areas of past operation of politics, local politics, and then we join these with bigger aspects of it. Yeah, can someone mute their background? There we go. Sounds like a mute your background if you have background noise, please. So we have areas like civic organizations, markets, and so forth. And within each of these, we cover some of the best ideas about how these things work and how they link to local politics. Then we say, how do these processes that have been analyzed for 10, 50, thousands of years, like markets, how do they change with globalization? And what's the big concept from Adam Smith, which links wealth and markets to globalization? What's his one, 4 words? His phrase is one phrase that captures this. And then we're interrelated. What are the key ideas in that section? It's a simple archetype. The big book is called The Wealth of Nations. It's still a core reading, and if only to criticize, but also to say where and why is it wrong, or what are the assumptions and so forth. And he's pretty good on laying out some of the assumptions as well as where they don't hold. The dependent variable is the wealth of nations. What's the independent variable? What causes more wealth in some nations and less in other nations? Or more within a city compared to a second city? Why should one city be more affluent and wealthy compared to another, following Smith's core ideas? You all should be able to discuss this with your aunts, uncles pretty fast. Here we go. Aaron?
It would be like market size and division of labor. So like the larger market size and therefore also like a broader division of labor, and you can have more wealth. As the market grows, it permits like more advanced division of labor. And that is a primary force for him in the building of wealth for nations.
Okay. Excellent. Perfect. You have everything except his label for this. I mean, you have all, you captured it pretty much with saying the size of the market, but how does he, and so his term is the extent of the market, which is almost the same, but extensiveness in this sense, he stresses, may be limited by national tariffs, especially, is one thing that a policy which could be changed and has been changed rapidly, for instance, in last 6 months between China, the US, parts of Europe, the Middle East, prices of oil, et cetera. All these things are going up and down. And then if the Russians invade Ukraine, the US is shipping all kinds of natural gas, so the Europeans won't be dependent on Russian, et cetera, et cetera. So these things are going on, and obviously with these examples, they're interrelated with military, with political, with economic, with cultural, in ways that Adam Smith himself wrote about in other books. But here he focused on the market. Okay. All right, that's a good clear example from that section. It illustrates what we're trying to do in the course in linking the processes and the size, the components of globalization. What are some different components of globalization? If we think of one as the extent of the market, what are other components of, and who wrote about this that we discussed? First section. Boschkin. Okay, what does Boschkin say about types of globalization? What is globalization? He says there's no, he and I am agreeing with him here, say there is no one simple answer. Globalization is highly variable depending on how you think about it and where you look. So you can't just walk into the Ukraine and say, is this global or not? You've got to ask, you've got to have a way of framing the question that comes from thinking about this and writings about it. And Boschkin does this in different sections. So he starts with and talks about economic and Wall Street, which is aspects of the wealth of nations. But another one we went back to historically, which precedes stock markets, which precedes big exchanges globally, was Genghis Khan. So Genghis Khan and his troops, and he started out with nothing. He's one guy who had a fight with his brother and his cousin and so forth. His father gave him a rough time, etc. Many of them got killed later on, but they organized a small area within Mongolia, and they spread. They created coalitions with a couple of others. Then they had more horsemen. They traveled with horses, and they went all the way across China, Russia, Poland, Iraq, Iran, in ways that have transformed the world ever since. Okay, 250 years they occupied Russia, and the Tsardom was created in response to try to get out these foreign mercenaries. I shouldn't say mercenaries, is the wrong term. It wasn't, they weren't tight colonial administrators. It was a loose kind of administration, which was but also subtle and done with enough looseness that it permitted the dukes and princes within Russia to maintain their religions, their castles, their art, and so forth. But at the same time, they pay a lot of money, etc. So Boschkin talks about transportation as another aspect of globalization through the internet. He doesn't stress the internet, but he stresses more the earlier historical, the railroads, shipping, rivers, etc. Another aspect of globalization, culture, entertainment, Hollywood, Bollywood, tourism. Tourism is the first or third largest industry in the world today, depending on how you do the accounting. Hugely important for China. For France, the tourism countries traditionally would say the Southern European along the Mediterranean. Now, many countries of the world, including the city of Chicago. The last few mayors have been hugely focused on, since 1993, Mayor Daley too really began to stress globalization. Tourism, visitors, and entertainment is a key component, building on the lakefront and its amenities with its concerts, with the beaches, with sports, with swimming, with races, running, triathlons, bike races, etc. Okay, so these, as you can somewhat see, if you can connect to Bollywood and you're in Argentina, it's pretty global. And it's harder for most electronic devices or controls over them, even there, to keep out, if they have an internet connection, many people from connecting, and that way led Claude Lévi-Strauss in the 1950s is saying in his book, Trees Tropique, anthropologists have lost their field. We can't do field work anymore by going to a village, taking our shoes off, being barefoot, and trying to learn the local language. The local people have television, they have telephones, they have internet, at least a little bit. Rural China now, 70% of rural Chinese say their main activities are downloading videos, talking to their friends over the internet. They don't say we go to the village square and play mahjong the way they did 30, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, bowling and the like. So personal relations are potentially undermined. How do these other complicated things work out as part of the things that are discussed as intermediary links in many of the other processes we have, such as Tocqueville? So in the section on Tocqueville, what's the big idea of Tocqueville? Way we talked about Adam Smith. What's the core X leads to Y? I'm simplifying, let's say Putnam's version, simplifying Tocqueville, but clearly it's there, but Tocqueville has lots of variables, lots of description, historical stuff. But what's the X leads to Y for Tocqueville? At least one big takeaway everybody should have. Mario Glass, you there?
Yeah.
Okay.
He talks about how, or the difference between equality and liberty, and that he also highlights that equality is actually preferred over liberty. Yeah.
Is that a cause or is that a definition? You want to show us your face, or you have a mask on today? There we go. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
So is that I asked about a causal arrow, X leads to Y. Is he talking about equality leads to liberty? No, these are two different alternative definitions.
Concepts.
And they're picked up by Lipset later on in his commentary on what are the values of Americans. So if you say, what are the values of Americans and how do they connect? And you've answered that question, but you didn't answer the question of what drives what's a key driver that Tocqueville stressed?
Is it that like like he says that democratic peoples have a strong passion for equality, but that may lead to delirium? Would that be a causal relationship?
Democratic peoples have a strong desire for equality. That's a good proposition that say, and that we could frame it, how could we reframe it as a more X leads to Y kind of idea? And then how could we test it? Either you or anybody else. What I'm asking right now, you ought to be able to frame this question or ask this question of anything else that we've said through a lot of the course in your readings and as you proceed. So yes, I mean, you're talking about concepts that are there, but you don't have a structure. That's what I'm saying. And a coherent sort of Blaylock type X leads to Y, Y leads to Z, and then another proposition where Z leads to K or whatever. That's the structure of a theory in natural science and social science and in literature. How about, I mean, an example? Okay, so I mean, so you said maybe democracy leads to equality, and that more democracy should, and that's a good general idea in the sense that the French Academy sent Tocqueville to the US and he said, we've got more democracy in France. What's this going to bring? If we get more and more democracy, how will we change in France? They didn't care about the US. They cared about their own country. They wanted to see, if we have more of this, what might we also get? And so if we get more democracy in France in 1820, what might it bring? And so your idea is, in a sense, maybe equality. That should be more stress on equality. And so I'm following up and saying, how could we assess that or make that a social science proposition or something to study the way that we've studied things in other books. How about the book by Robert Putnam called Making Democracy Work in Italy, on contrasting Italy? How did he do it? And how would that help answer your question, or my question to your ideas? Remember anything from that we talked about, or if you looked at it yet? It contrasted northern and southern Italy, especially in the north, some cities that had a lot of trade, like Florence, Genoa, Venice, and how they were different from the cities in the south of Italy. Why were they different? They had less democracy in the south. Why did they have less democracy historically? So they were conquered by the Romans. It was a military issue. But in the north, they had the Vatican, and you had a lot of authoritarian princes for years, but these cities began doing things like trading to get more coffee, or discover coffee, and bring in interesting foods and colors and textiles and so forth. And as they brought that in, they brought in new ideas, and that brought in the idea of participation and democracy as well from the ancient Greeks and the ancient Jews. And these were sort of rediscovered by the Europeans in the Renaissance, which sort of sparked this kind of transition. All right, so if we have democracy coming in along with the potentially equality, maybe they're loosely related. With Putnam, what did Putnam do that was creative to try to say, how can we look at the relations between these things and some other variables? Anybody look at the book on democracy? And well, let me ask about he also then has a paper called Bowling Alone. He has an argument there that relates to democracy and equality. Anybody remember that one? It's a little different. What's he say there?
Isn't his argument that like more like participation in clubs and like things along those lines like make like civil engagement like happen at higher levels?
Exactly. And so civil engagement, yes. But if you're bowling with a club instead of bowling without a club shirt, that's not a linkage to higher levels. How does that relate? How does his theorizing suggest it might relate to higher levels of what? Of government, say, or of the press, or of the military? And how and why might they connect? What are some related concepts that he discusses? What are the big concepts? What are 3 big concepts that came from Max Weber that become 5 concepts in scenescapes? 5 dimensions in scenescapes. Begins with L. It's Valentine's Day. It's related to love. How can love be made more legitimate? Was Max Weber's question. L for legitimacy. And what did he answer? How can you build legitimacy? You want to be Saddam Hussein? You don't want your army to desert. Problem with Saddam, he didn't care about legitimacy. He just said, get in my army and fight. And in the first battle, everybody left. They ran home. Almost. He didn't have legitimacy. His troops didn't care. They weren't committed to fighting for him and potentially, of course, getting killed. But if you have strong legitimacy the way Napoleon did, Napoleon had huge legitimacy and huge charisma as a leader and with his troops. And he went all the way, across Central Europe, Eastern Europe, up to Moscow, didn't get far because, etc., down to Egypt and so forth, and brought back huge sculptures from Egypt, which are in Paris today. How did he have that legitimacy? So Weber, what type of legitimacy did Weber say it was? In part. charismatic. Did it have a second kind of legitimacy he discussed, which would be traditional? And the third type is more bureaucratic, rational bureaucratic. So Napoleon built a lot of rational bureaucratic things, but they were especially focused on tough schools so that you could have French schools that would teach people to make better artillery for the military as well. And so they trained a lot of people in mathematics in France. And France today is one of the international leaders, along with the Russians and others, in mathematics. So I'm just running through types of legitimacy. We're getting now back to Mariel. In the Scenescapes book, we go beyond Weber and we add one more dimension called egalitarianism. We didn't invent it in the book. The French stressed it in 1789 in their revolution, and they had three themes there, one of which were liberté, égalité, and fraternité, fraternity of feeling some kind of connection with others. So those three dimensions, where that is, we stressed more, as I would say in a number of measures, the cultural sensitivity to equality is much stronger in the 20th century. And the 21st century, after 1968, after 1989, these medium-sized cultural revolutions, they weren't Marxist economic revolutions, but they were cultural and thinking revolutions about who we are and what we do in ways that have had huge impacts. So if we try to say, how might democracy link with equality? One could say, let's compare different cities, as we do in many of the sections of this course. We compare cities across nations. So we can look at Genoa versus Salerno in North and South Italy, and then say where and why are they doing different things, and how do these variously build legitimacy or not? Okay. So he has a lot of qualitative evidence, Putnam does, for instance, that the tough administration of a bureaucracy tended to undermine legitimacy. And people, average citizens, couldn't get what they wanted. How did he measure that? How can you try to, that is, instead of just telling stories from his history books, he did a survey. Well, how did he do his survey? He surveyed all the regions. That's a title for, it's like a state in the US, a little state. He studied the regions of Italy by doing what? Send a postcard and say, could you please send me one of these forms? He asked for a form. And in places like Genoa and Florence, he got it right back. They sent him the form. Places like Salerno, nothing. Sent us two forms. No, he sent me two requests. They would go in, he and his staff would go in person to the local government and say, we're trying to get one of these forms. Could you please help? No, we don't know about that form. We don't know anything about it. Sometimes I won't say that they did it in this survey, but some implicitly would say, you didn't pay anything. You don't pay anything from the local official. You don't get anything back. What do you expect? And so the people who did more of that were called and are called in the South, the mafia. So the mafia try to fill that gap and say, I'll take care of you. We will protect you and your business so you won't get the windows broken and people won't rob you from your business. And why don't you give us a little fee to keep on protecting you next week too? So the mafia is in many areas of the world today. Maybe not called the mafia, but they have many local governments that use threats of terror or threats of violence, private exchanges, what's good for you, of keeping you safe. You give me some money, or in a political system, just give me your political support. in a war, come out and fight with me with our troops. And that was the sort of European feudal system, and we have that today in parts of the world, for sure. Okay, so what else? What other themes do we have, that big themes that you all ought to be able to easily comment on? We had a book on the third sector. What's one big theme of the third sector? Why is this? Why do I mention this now in this context of globalization? Do we have equally important third sectors in China and in France and in the US? No. Why not? And what are the biggest differences? Be a good simple exam question. Why are they different, and when and how have they changed? Quick answer is social organizations, civic groups, and so forth were illegal in France, 18th, 19th century. You know, you'd be taken to prison. You wouldn't be able to. If you tried to create something, a civic group which might be a potential political threat, they'd close you down, or they'd censor, and the government would send in interrogators or spies to see who's doing what. If they're having a big dinner, you make a reservation for 200 people. Maybe they'll send someone along and say, you know, what are you going to talk about? So 19th century France, in the book of one Princeton historian, Roger Shattuck, was called the banquet years, because they had lots of banquets. And they talk about in subtle ways about why the king or the prime minister or the military ought to be changed and what was wrong with them. That is, they would do a certain more subtle form of political critique along with entertainment, humor, caricature, cartoons, and so forth. Across the British, so I'm making the point, these were illegal in general on the continent. Why were they illegal? Because the government was political authoritarian, and they said, basically, we want a monopoly on power and control. No challenges to us. No cafes, no newspapers that critique us. And the big argument of Habermas is that this was generally true in the European continent in the 19th into over the 19th century, but it changed by the late 19th century. And he details that change in Germany and France and other countries, but he contrasts it with the situation in England, Scotland, British Isles, where they had much earlier open discussion because they had more political autonomy from the state. You did not have such political authoritarianism from earlier on. And in that way, the English in their cafes, or they call them tea houses, coffee shops. In France, they were cafes, Vienna, so forth. But the coffee, the related clubs and coffee houses and so forth in London, they had hundreds of them in London and Paris, but they're very different from Berlin and the like. These went from wagering, will your ship come in safely or not? I'll give, if so, I'll buy the cargo for this amount of money, the futures. They start making bets and then saying, or I'll even buy what you've got in your ship. It's coming from India. I'll give you 5,000 British pounds if you've got this, So someone else in turn could say, well, I'll take half of that, whatever. And then they'd raise or lower the price. This led to the London stock market. This led to the insurance companies. This led to accounting firms. And it enhanced technology of international telescopes and trying to get your bearings from the stars, so that ships, and the British Navy, of course, was the backbone of making this work through the 18th, 19th century. Okay. Orlando Patterson is a famous Black sociologist at Harvard. He grew up in Kingston in the Caribbean. And he said, you know, when we were kids, age 8, age 14, you know, we'd sing, Hail Britannia, Britannia rule the waves. You'd sort of think about it. Do we like that? Does that make sense? Okay, he has a sense of humor, as well as being, his big thesis was on slavery and how do you build or undermine any of that. All right, let's see. And he studied things like cricket. That cricket now helps to maintain legitimacy and connections in the British areas, BBC and so forth today, even though there's no longer the political connection. That rap in its international form came from Kingston and then went to New York and Miami and back and forth, and took its shape with these kinds of concerns. Question, I mean, I'm talking and asking you questions, but let's say, Shadira Jaffrey, do you want to wave to us and maybe ask a question about anything? Shirada,
I'm good for now. Thank you.
You're good for now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay. Maxwell Shopcorn.
I don't have any questions. I'm good.
Okay. Robert Deans. And just getting to see people's faces is, you know, we can pretend that we're having class in person for if we see some faces for a while.
I have no questions right now. Thank you.
Okay, great. Let's see. Charlotte Stender.
Hi.
You've been great in bringing in Chicago area differences.
I have a question that is not related to Chicago.
Go ahead. Great.
Can we talk, this is a very vague question. Can we talk a little bit more about the world being flat? I'm looking back at notes and just in general, it's something I'm not super remembering.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Who wants to start some of that discussion? Is the world flat? Where's the term come from? And if it were more true or less true for different cities or countries, what difference would that make? It's a quotation from a high-level computer engineer who founded a big Indian high-tech computer company, and he said this to Thomas Friedman, who was an editorial page writer for the New York Times. Written a lot of, he's one of the top journalists in the US and is a very smart analyst of global patterns. And so he said, you know, how did you ever develop this fabulous rival to the California Silicon Valley here in India? And the answer was, the world is flat. We can do it anywhere. And so one of the challengers to that is Richard Florida. So we go back and forth. So Florida says, no, the world is spiky. It's not flat. Spiky means there's some places which have talent, money, entertainment, and they concentrate in a particular area, like Nashville, Tennessee is a spiky center of creating new music. So Lady Gaga, when she went to NYU, she grew up in New York. When she wanted to become a star, where did she go in addition to studying at NYU? She went to Nashville. because there were people there building their careers and getting going. And she felt, and she learned from it. But the point is, there are more people per capita who are doing this in Nashville than in Hollywood or New York or anywhere else. So in that sense, there may be small cities that are very global leaders and the world is flat. Maybe, but if you want to be someone who's really top, you usually want to be studying or linking or getting to know some of the tricks of the other top people. And so that's why Lady Gaga would and other people would go there to Nashville or to Hollywood or to somewhere in New York. Friedman is not a social scientist. He's a smart journalist, and he's committed to a sort of anti-social science randomness view that you can't really be coherent, although he's implicitly doing so when he says the world is flat. And Florida is coming back with, I mean, Florida based on a lot of research of people in the natural sciences and where does knowledge come from. The knowledge economy tends to be, or let me add as well, the arts. The arts are more stratified than almost any other field of work and payment or lack of payment. The top artists like a Picasso or a handful of people today, I mean, are very, very successful. Their market prices are enormous, but 70, 80, 90% of artists can't make enough to maintain themselves with a living wage. So they work as taxi drivers or waiters or other things as well. All right, so that's a quick comment on the world is flat. Is the world flat, say, within India or within China? Is Friedman saying everybody in India could be or is equally well off in terms of being able to participate in the global economy? So, oh no. Friedman says, oh no, I'm only talking about 5% or so of the population, people who, they know how to do programs and jump ahead of Microsoft and things like that. So he's talking about a very small population, but nevertheless, that small population can exist in India just as others do elsewhere. Alex?
Sorry. Yeah. Quick question on that was just when he's talking about like the people who can leapfrog, does he include people who may have less quote unquote technical skills, i.e. people like in a call center or like basic kind of labor functions within these companies, or is it just like the programmers?
That's a critical, excellent question, which someone I think in this course talked to us about. Was it Grace Kim or someone else, basically, who said, we have an explosion, maybe explosion's a little strong, but we've had a large growth of universities, college programs, which teach you to be a call center employee or staffer in India. And there are lots of people who do that, especially because they have the English language shared with the rest of the world. But your question takes it a step further. Are these really the people who are the most central in terms of amount of creativity or amount of recognition or papers cited or money paid for patents or things like that? And the answer is obviously not. These are very different people. Can you move from one to the other? For sure. That is, if you can start out with some degree of background, but usually, and it depends on the field and so forth. If you want to get to very highly technical area, like how do you rebuild DNA to make better vaccines for COVID? That's a little more technical than you get in most colleges. So the people who are doing that right at the top that's what's obviously being debated about. I wouldn't obviously. Many different centers are trying to compete with each other, but in a sense, they're spiky centers. They're not really, even though potentially, you can move. So when Trump was president, he brought the top German researchers on COVID and say, wouldn't you like to be Americans? We'll pay you a lot more. We'll give you all sorts of research stuff. And the Germans said, Dankeschön, and they went back to Germany. Okay. Is that enough of an answer, or we can go further? Anybody want to elaborate?
No, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. I've taught courses on social stratification, when sociologists pay a lot of attention to what are the barriers, why can't you get up from one to the other, and how much, in fact, does that happen, and so forth. And we pointed out, for instance, that Genghis Khan, long ago, he had a lot of meritocracy. So people, you didn't have to be of a particular religion, from a region, you didn't have to be Mongolian at all. You could be Turkish, you could be Iranian, you could join Genghis Khan's troops and get paid off and rewarded. But you had to fight well when it was time to fight. Okay, so in that sense, and Napoleon, by the way, said the same thing. Here's a duke who's a particularly nice gentleman. Wouldn't you like to have him as one of your generals? So Napoleon classically would ask, how did he do in his last battle? Oh, well, he had a few problems. How about the battle before that? Well, it went pretty well. Said, next time bring me someone who doesn't have failures in his last two battles. So meritocracy wasn't invented in the 21st century. And there are many different dimensions of it, but it's implicitly omitted in a lot of discussions of discrimination and stratification, where we have a lot of journalistic. And my quick answer to that is, how strong is any one of these variables in explaining something else, like father's education? How strongly does father's education or parents' education explain children's education? Medium. But you can have tables, and you can say the table looks strong. But if you say, how much variation, how many other things are there which also explain the children's education? Well, you can have scholarships, fellowships, quality of schools, quality of students in the schools, quality of the teachers in the schools, media, all those things make a difference. And you add them up, and they explain usually about 15%, which is to say, chance, luck, and things like that, noise, explains a whole lot. And social scientists hate to recognize that, and the journalists even more. Shubha Ray. Hand up.
Yes, Professor, I was just wondering, it's a different tangent though, but I was looking at my notes, and there was a particular week where, I think it was the week we discussed Lipset and Engelhardt, and we spoke a little about how egalitarianism is born from a very rigid hierarchy. And I don't think I was very clear on that. So if we could talk about that a little bit more, that would be great.
Sure, okay. The idea is that, that is, the first proposition is that the stronger the hierarchy, the more likely we are to have anti-hierarchical movements. That is too simple, and we can state it that way, but it assumes that you can fight, or that you can somehow express yourself to challenge the hierarchy. And so in an authoritarian or a loose authoritarian political system, you can do that. If you really have what's called, say, a totalitarian political system, like the Nazis or Stalin in some ways, you try to do that and you get your head chopped off. And so there's no way to express dissent. But you get to China today and you've got all kinds of dissent. The people got all sorts of social media. People are challenging, saying, we're all sorts of problems, and are being discussed actively and openly. And so the question, if we try to say what are the themes, what do people talk about? And and the one general idea is that the stronger the hierarchy at the beginning, the more you have people that just say, I want more equality. I'm against the hierarchy of those people holding us down, who aren't letting us do what we want. But if you then have, say, the 1789 revolution in France, or you have the Maoist revolution, or you have revolutions which may bring in more equality in various ways, or at least potential to challenge. You have groups who, for instance, they emailed me from Beijing. A group said, we'd like to start a Chinese group that would deal with the new political culture in China. And I said, really, that's fascinating. You're discovering this in China. I said, what are some examples that you see in Beijing of people acting in ways that follow the new political culture? What are the kinds of civic groups, for example, that you see? So, well, dog walkers. Okay, I was amazed. Okay, so dog walking was a big issue in Beijing. They have to clean up after their dogs. They need parks. So to hear that, do you read that in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times? No. Okay, so do you have dog walking and dog walkers expressed as a major kind of civic group at the beginning? No, but it's later on, if you have a revolution, if the revolution succeeds, whatever, then you have maybe a year, maybe a century or two. If we have the French case, it takes a good century or so. But by the end of the 19th century, you had more and more groups saying, let's have the political authoritarianism decreased enough that more and more groups said, let's have groups that do more, or say a stronger version still. After 1989, when the Berlin Wall went down, the first Polish election said, we have democracy. We can have any political party that they want run for the National Assembly in Poland. They had 200 parties and related civic groups. They had one for beer drinkers. They had one for safe sex. They had parties. Those are their only programs. That is, these were not the general left, the general right. They had a particular issue specificity that attracted people in ways that illustrated the breaking up of the ideological connections, which are tighter when you're fighting against hierarchy. So the general idea is that as hierarchy declines, we have a differentiation of ideological positions and more issue politics, rather than strong hierarchical one program or one issue, or I won't say one issue, sort of a core set of interrelated issues like the classic left and right in the 19th and 20th centuries in Russia and let's say in Europe and in Europe and North America, Latin America. Is that enough of an answer, or you got more follow-ups? Okay, and that's the quick general idea. And this is one of the main big ideas in a book called The New Political Culture. So it's right at the beginning. There are three. That is, we have general propositions, of which these are three. One more was simply close to what we discussed in the new social movement section, where they had three concepts, but one was basically shared by the two of us, which is that the degree that you have an organization that is doing these kinds of things, organizing its followers, building, getting the followers to work with you, to pass out flyers, to collect petitions, to drive people to election voting booths, to help people get food, to give them vacations or take them together, to teach them to sing together, to help each other, with health and so forth. Okay, so those can build organizational strength, and more organizational strength implies that you've got more legitimacy and more consistency ideologically as well. So these big general ideas inform then about 25 more specific propositions about differentiation of, let me ask one question if anybody picked this one up. When are women elected to public office in terms of the findings we have following these ideas in I think it's chapter 4 of the New Political Culture book? Where do you have women elected to more? Why are there more women mayors and women city councils in England, in Italy, and in the US? And why did I choose those countries? Okay, the quick finding is the number of women council members increased hugely in England with Tony Blair. When Tony Blair first ran for office for prime minister, he found a whole lot of women who were political candidates, and he slated them in those areas where they would win, where that is strong labor voting regions of England. And there's this, in the intermediary chapter, we have a discussion of that. And there were blue collar male voters who were angry with Tony Blair and say, I'm a Labor Party person. I don't want to vote against the Labor Party, but I'm not going to vote for one of these women that Tony Blair is putting up there. And so non-voting went way up among the blue collar workers in England when Tony Blair first ran. Nevertheless, there were enough blue collar and others, white collars and other, who voted for those women council members, and sorry, let's say also national parliament members, that there were more members of parliament elected under Tony Blair than ever before. Okay, what's the linkage between gender and political success? Is it just gender? That is a lot of discussion of diversity. You say, oh, if you're a woman, you do, this happens. If you're a man, then this results. Not so. The main point of this, one main point of these sections of the courses, there are all kinds of intervening variables, and you've got to look at those, and they change how these things work. So the intervening variable here is in the US, it's called the primary. In England and in Italy, it's slating. You don't have primary elections in most of the world. US and Mexico are the only places that, Taiwan are the three places that had it classically. Now it's beginning to spread, but that is elections in the sense that average citizens can vote for who are the candidates that the party will present. And the most famous is, of course, the state primaries for the US presidential elections. But the point is, the parties don't ask, they did, and the top leaders slated these, and they were, and the same was true in Italy. So in Italy, in the southern Italian cities I mentioned, which were communist, they would slate 50% of all the city council members in those Italian towns were women. And so communist cities in southern Italy had women council, had 50% women council members. How about in the US? I've illustrated how the parties were the drivers, were the key intervening variable there. Did that work in the US? No. Different causal mechanism. What was it? Civic groups, not just parties, and leaders, like especially mayors, who would look for and try to respond to not just choosing individuals, but would look for citizen preferences. So if you had, say, blue collar voters who were, let's say, successful steelworkers, or whatever, successful steelworkers, but they weren't really poor and they weren't women and maybe less educated, you would tend to try to represent those views as a city council member. And you would not have so many, and the party in those locations would not slate women for so many positions in the US. By contrast, in the US, if you had more, if take a crude things that are measurable, African-American and poor, low in income, those locations had more often redistributive policies stressed by the mayors and the council members. There's a table on this. And so the point is, citizens, the characteristics of citizens measured simply by race and income, and had a strong, significant impact on the percentage of policies that were articulated by the mayor in terms of, do you want to spend more, same, or the less in each of these following areas, 15 areas. When they were asked about public health, public welfare, and public hospitals, those mayors said more money. We want to spend more on those because we have more poor people in our cities. When you ask the same questions and you look at the same results in Italy, in England, in France, zero relationship. Having more people, more poor people in a poor French city doesn't mean that the elected officials respond to the poor at all. They follow the national party line as the normal pattern. So in that sense, the Tony Blair linkage shows you what may lead to more women, but which may lead to less spending on poor people. But the main point is the dynamics are more national in the European context, but not just simply national. We've linked it to the parties. In the US, it's a more local. And of course, in the US, related to that is parties are different in different cities. The cities, that is one finding in some years we've had, are Democratic or Republican cities likely to spend more money through their local budgets? Answer, zero relationship between the parties. Republican cities in some locations spend more than Democrats. So then you can try to bring in controls. What if you control for education and income? Then it changes. What if you add something else like youth? That may change it as well. But the point is, party alone or any one of these variables alone tends to be weak to moderate. You bring it in with a few others, it may help explain a little more, but life is complicated and there's no one simple one factor kind of driving process that is out there. Okay. Let's see, that was more, we started really from Shubina's question. Shubina, you're asking, you're reading carefully. Shubina and Charlotte, clearly you're reading closely, you're thinking about these issues yourselves. And Aaron obviously working on his master's essay, he's thinking about this stuff a lot. You folks, how about hitting us with something that says, how do we go beyond the X leads to Y leads to Z kind of answers? For instance, in the Scenescapes book, or in entrepreneurial urban politics as examples from the Scenescapes book, for instance. We had a lot of discussion of Chicago, especially because most of you are not from Chicago, but Chicago is the most studied city in the world. That's why I came here. It's why I've stayed and keep coming back. It's a fascinating place, even though we don't have Parisian food. We've now got, that is years ago when I first came here, I nearly died with the food. Now we got top restaurants here that are better than Paris. So whatever, etc. Not to mention the local neighborhood cultures. So my question to you three. Give us an example of something which is not just X leads to Y. What's an important kind of alternative causal dynamic, we might say, that we could show in a Blaylock type terms? One which is used explicitly in the first chapter of Scenescapes is something like X leads to Y, but then Z comes down. Z is something else like globalization, and Z strengthens or weakens that path from X leads to Y. So it's not as if one is right and one is wrong. The causal kind of modeling is to say this is enhancing, or the statistical term is interacting with, it's suppressing. These are all action verbs which capture this kind of causal dynamic. So the point is, there's causality is a important but subtle and complicated process which can be modeled, and Blaylock is one of the persons I've talked about. Just look at the pictures and you can see many different ways that we have subtle things working for. So what's an example of how of how, say, high-tech jobs. So Richard Florida did a paper I mentioned. Gays, cities with more gays, metro areas, literally, he didn't say cities, metro areas with more gays have more high-tech jobs and more growth of high-tech jobs. Did he say, or was he saying that the gays are holding or building or expanding and causing the jobs? Yeah, go ahead.
No. To be honest, I don't remember exactly what he says, but from what I'm remembering here, it would be something along the lines of like, well, why is the city attracting so many people like that? And it would be ideas of like a city is normally more cosmopolitan and therefore has more social rights, social justices, like individual rights ideas, stuff like that. So, you know, gay men or women or whoever will go kind of to those cities. And it's just kind of a byproduct as those cities also generally as like the more individual rights focused, this kind of comes from like the NPC and such, that book and such, is they have more professional and technical operations. So it's really not not an A to B, like, oh, you know, more gay people automatically means you have more technical capacity or industrial capacity or whatever such, or professional post-industrial jobs. It's more that if a city is catering to post-industrial jobs, which also includes culture and such like that, it generally can attract you know, gay and lesbian and other people of non-normative per se sexual tendencies or other things like that, minorities of sorts that may be somewhat ostracized in other not quite as large cities. Yeah, sorry, as I said, I don't really remember exactly what Florida says, but that's kind of like my very general thought on it.
No, I mean, that's excellent. I mean, what you've reinvented is pretty much what I and Ed Glazer and others have said. And we've looked at it statistically. I got Florida's original data for all the US metro areas, and then reanalyzed the same data he did in the book, The Cities and Entertainment Machine, and showed that that if you just include education as another variable related to many of those things you talk about, the key one that Florida would stress conceptually was tolerance. That gays are an indicator of tolerance. And so he then even sometimes would add bohemians are more tolerant. And so Balzac and Baudelaire wrote about, if we have more bohemians, then we can really have an artistic neighborhood and be very creative, more so than if we're trying to be proper and dress and act and think and have proper dinners and so forth, the way they do in a good so-called French bourgeois family. So yes, I mean, that's the core idea and the way that it was tested. And basically the gays fell to insignificance when we added education across the metro areas. So if we just look at X leads to Y, Florida may be wrong. But if you listen more closely to what Florida was saying, do these gay people lead to more jobs? His basic answer was no, but it's really the tolerance in the city which is larger, and that in turn we could draw a bow-headed arrow between, showing the connection between the gays, percentage gays, and tolerance measured in different ways. If he didn't try to do so there, he does later on, following me and others. But tolerance would be the driver, and it may be strong enough that without the tolerance, there's a zero direct effect. So you can draw arrows for each of these causal paths and say, how strong is each of these potential causal paths? And you can try to test these ideas with quantitative data, if you've got it from Florida, from the census or some other source, or it can be from, hello? Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm teaching a class right now, but I tried to reach you, and I sent a my chart memo proposing a time. But if we could either respond that way, or I'll call you back if you can tell me how I could reach you. But I thank you much. Okay. Sorry, I got surgery tomorrow, so I'm trying to get things set up. So Florida's and you seeing and thinking about all these discussions. So I mean, Alex gave us, Alex mentioned about 15 variables there. We could draw, or sorry, Aaron, we could draw 15 arrows, and then if we had data from either that kind of, and so many different kinds of data are possible. If we're doing an ethnography, if we're talking, say, one person, one smart person who really knows Silicon Valley and another person who knows a computer town in India, we could say, tell me, you've worked and that guy had worked both in Silicon Valley and in India, and they go back and forth, and they would contract out, and they buy and sell, people and ideas and products and so forth. Say, tell me how they're different. And how does this work? How does that work? That is, you can ask them, how important is tolerance in India? How important is bohemianism in China or Japan or Korea? And so where did we do this in any one of the readings that we've talked about, or you may have read? To contrast to Asia and how these things, how innovation gets connected with things like gays, bohemian, and Asia. What's the general Asian pattern, and how's it so different from the European and North American pattern? At least in the 20th and early 21st century. You talk about bohemians in Asia, and people say, what's that? They don't have bohemians generally in Asia the way these are central aspects of French culture, and then now, since 1968, Northern European and North American culture. And bohemianism sort of saying, I dress with jeans and red hair and green hair and different kinds of clothes, which I combine, which are saying I'm a different sort of person, and I don't dress the way my parents told me to, or the general middle class bourgeois square people do. I'm cool. And so in that sense, clothing is a marker of many other things, which can be connected with the bohemian, but the bohemian general challenging of authority is less successful or less visible also in Southern Europe. Strong Catholicism, strong families, or let's say religion in the case of India, strong parties in the case of China, weaken the workings of this kind of bohemian dynamic, which you have in Northern Europe, which is more Protestant, more individualistic, and in that sense, you thus could have. So when I was teaching in Florence, and I went to Florence because I wanted to see how are Italian cities different and how these things are working, and the faculties and the professors in political science and sociology, it's one department there, they said, we have a new mayor. He doesn't know anything. I said, really? What's his background? Oh, he's a professor of physics here at the University of Florence. So he must know something. Well, but he doesn't know how politics works in Italy. I said, well, what do you mean? Well, people really are trained. They go to the party school. And really, and what do they learn at the party school? Well, you gotta reward people who give you something in turn. They learn clientelism. They learn how to write a political party program and so forth. That's what the party school would teach. I say, this guy, and he's talking about the environment. He's talking about human rights. Those aren't Italian political issues. These come from this guy, Jimmy Carter. He's a kooky guy in the American South. Nobody cares about him. That's what they said to me. 10 years later, I told you, Italian television covers egalitarian stuff with an strong, explicit egalitarian focus, reducing the level of discussion between the president of the European Union, the prime minister of Italy, and the kids, 14-year-old kids in high schools in Bosnia and in Italy, and soccer players in Italy who come from Bosnia, and so forth. All we're talking to each other for 4 hours. It's amazing. So it's an illustration of how sort of the in-between processes of how can you have democracy lead to egalitarianism, and once you have more normative egalitarianism, how does that lead to different patterns of coverage, say in social media or in mass media with television. Before the social media took off, there was a guy who had a lot of money and he had several television and radio, TV stations named Berlusconi. He destroyed the whole Italian political system before him. He destroyed the Italian Communist Party, the Christian Democratic Party, and the Socialist Party. Read Putnam's book. Those were everything in Italy until Berlusconi after 1989. Now they have 30 or so parties. And a bit of anarchy. Okay. What have we left out? Anything else that, well, we also have 2 sessions, which our TAs are Shiran and Abhishek. When are your sessions session for review as well? Remind us, please.
I think Shiran already had his, and mine is tomorrow. Tomorrow at 4:30. 4:30. Yeah.
So tomorrow at 4:30 until when?
4 to 5:30. 4 to 5:30.
4 to 5:30. And how do students? Please can you make your background mute? Somebody who got a lot of noise. Okay. How do they connect to the meeting?
I'll send a Zoom link. I'll drop a Zoom link in the announcement section.
Okay, so no, but not just here in announcements. What we need, because people may not be here today, but if you can send it out maybe, or both, whatever, but
on Canvas.
Yeah,
on Canvas. I'll do it on Canvas.
Okay, that's great. And Shiran, how about you? Do you have a session, or are you part of that, or you have a separate session?
Yeah, I have had my review session.
Oh, you did already? Okay.
Yeah, last Friday.
Oh, okay, that's great. That's why. Do you have any questions from that session you want to bring up now and just in the last minute, just to give a flavor of how it went or problems?
For my session, the main concern is that the midterm is going to cover the social movement literature.
Okay, the answer is yes.
Yes.
Was that the biggest question?
Basically, yes.
Okay, no other questions.
Other questions are basically logistic housekeeping questions regarding the format of the midterm exam. That's all.
Okay. As you probably heard, we have identification questions count roughly 30%, concepts like legitimacy and so forth, and then an essay, and you get to choose from, say, 3 essays, 2 or 3 essays, topics, and then you can create your own essay drawing on what you know and making a coherent statement.